The sun was setting over the quiet neighborhood of Maplewood Grove as the Carter family's moving truck pulled up to their new home. The air was thick with the scent of autumn leaves and the faint sounds of children playing in the nearby park. Ethan Carter took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the fresh, cool air of suburbia. After years of living in a bustling city, this was a different world entirely. He glanced over at his wife, Jasmine, who was already peering out the car window, a soft smile on her face. "It's beautiful," Jasmine murmured, her gaze sweeping over the tree-lined street and the rows of neatly kept houses, each standing proudly behind a white picket fence or manicured lawn. Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. "Yeah. It really is. Feels like a place we can finally call home." Their daughter, Mia, a bright-eyed teenager with a head full of curls, was less enthused. "So, where's the closest coffee shop? Or like, anything exciting?" Jasmine chuckled. "You'll survive, Mia. Who knows? You might even make some new friends." Mia rolled her eyes but didn't argue, leaning her head back against the seat as Ethan pulled the car up to the curb. The moving truck came to a stop behind them, and the driver gave Ethan a thumbs up. The house itself was everything they'd dreamed of, 2 stories. Spacious, with a wide front porch and a large backyard. Jasmine had fallen in love with it the moment she'd seen the photos online. And Ethan couldn't deny that it felt like the perfect place to put down roots. As they stepped out of the car, they noticed some of their new neighbors watching from their windows or yards. Some waved politely, while others kept their distance, observing with mild curiosity. Ethan raised his hand in a friendly wave, his easygoing smile never faltering. "Guess they're checking out the new folks in town," he joked to Jasmine. Jasmine smirked. "We'll give them something to talk about soon enough. I was thinking we could host a welcoming barbecue once we're settled in, introduce ourselves properly." "Sounds perfect. Knowing you, you'll make sure everyone in Maplewood Grove feels welcome." The sound of car doors slamming brought the couple's attention to a figure approaching from the house next door. She was an older woman with graying hair pulled back into a tight bun, wearing a knitted cardigan that seemed a size too large. Her face held a stern expression, lips pressed into a thin line as she approached. "Hello there," Ethan greeted warmly. "We're the Carters, just moved in." The woman's eyes flickered over him. Then Jasmine. And finally Mia, who was dragging her suitcase out of the trunk with a look of reluctance. "I'm Mrs. Harris," she said stiffly. "I've lived here for nearly 40 years. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to decipher what kind of people the Carters were. "Quiet neighborhood. Maplewood Grove. We like it that way." Ethan detected the hint of warning in her tone but chose to ignore it, extending a hand. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Harris. We're looking forward to getting to know everyone." Mrs. Harris hesitated for a moment before reaching out to shake his hand. Her grip was firm, though her expression remained distant. "Just remember," she said, her gaze sweeping over the family, "we value peace and order here. No loud parties. No late nights. And certainly no trouble." Jasmine raised an eyebrow, her smile unwavering. "Of course, Mrs. Harris. We wouldn't dream of disturbing the peace." Mrs. Harris gave a curt nod and retreated back toward her house, muttering something under her breath that they couldn't quite catch. Once she was out of earshot, Mia snickered. "Friendly, isn't she?" Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, not everyone's going to be thrilled about new neighbors. We'll give it time." Jasmine placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We'll win them over, Ethan. You'll see." Over the next few days, the Carters threw themselves into the work of settling in. Jasmine unpacked boxes with efficient precision, turning the empty rooms into warm, inviting spaces. Ethan spent hours assembling furniture and arranging the living room just right. Mia, though initially sullen, found herself drawn to the backyard, where she set up a cozy reading nook under a tree, secretly relishing the peace and quiet. But even as they tried to blend in, they couldn't ignore the occasional cold stares from certain neighbors. Mrs. Harris, in particular, seemed to always be watching, her disapproving gaze lingering on them from her front porch. Some neighbors were friendly, but many were cautious, reserved, as though unsure of what to make of the newcomers. After nearly a week, Jasmine decided it was time to host the barbecue. She spent the afternoon preparing her favorite recipes, organizing the backyard, and sending out invitations around the neighborhood. "We'll make it a simple, welcoming affair," she told Ethan as she set out trays of food on the patio. "No one can resist good food and good company." As the sun began to set, guests started to arrive. Slowly, the backyard filled with the hum of chatter and laughter. Families brought dishes to share, and children ran around, playing games under the watchful eyes of their parents. Ethan worked the grill, flipping burgers and chatting with anyone who approached. Jasmine moved through the crowd, engaging everyone with her natural charm. Even the most reserved guests found themselves warming up to her, captivated by her friendliness. Mia, much to her own surprise, had struck up a conversation with another teenage girl, and they were laughing over shared music interests. Yet, amidst the warm camaraderie, Mrs. Harris was conspicuously absent. Jasmine spotted her peeking out from behind her curtains, watching the party with a tight-lipped frown. Jasmine gave her a wave, but Mrs. Harris only scowled and retreated further into her house. As the evening wore on, the party grew louder with laughter and music, everyone reveling in the chance to unwind. The Carters were finally beginning to feel accepted, enjoying a sense of belonging they hadn't felt in a long time. But just as Ethan was raising a toast to their new beginning, the sound of sirens cut through the air. The laughter died down as everyone turned toward the front yard, where 2 police cars had pulled up, lights flashing. Ethan's heart sank as he realized what was happening. The officers stepped out, looking around at the gathering with a wary eye. "Someone called in a noise complaint," one of the officers announced, his tone apologetic. "We were told there was a disturbance here." A hush fell over the crowd, guests exchanging uneasy glances. Jasmine felt a flash of anger as she noticed Mrs. Harris standing on her porch, arms folded, her expression smug. Ethan took a deep breath, stepping forward. He knew this moment would either solidify their place in this community, or deepen the divides lurking beneath the surface. "Officers," he began, his voice calm but firm. "There's no disturbance here. I should know, because I'm Ethan Carter, the new police chief." The words hung in the air, the crowd going silent as the realization set in. Mrs. Harris's face paled, her smug expression dissolving into shock. The officers, who now recognized him, exchanged embarrassed glances. Ethan stood tall, looking around at his neighbors. "I hope everyone's enjoying themselves," he said, his tone laced with a quiet strength that left no room for doubt. One by one, the neighbors nodded, murmuring their agreement. Jasmine stepped up beside him, her hand resting on his arm, a silent show of support. And as they stood together, the Carters knew this was only the beginning of a journey that would change their neighborhood, and their lives, forever. As the officers returned to their cars, the guests at the barbecue slowly returned to their conversations. Though the atmosphere had noticeably shifted, Ethan's revelation left a mark. A silent wave of both admiration and discomfort spreading through the crowd. People whispered to one another, some shooting wary glances in the direction of Mrs. Harris's house, where she had disappeared behind her door. Jasmine, sensing the unease, was quick to diffuse the tension. She clapped her hands together, drawing everyone's attention. Well, let's not let a little excitement ruin our evening. Who's up for seconds? Laughter rippled through the crowd, and the tension began to melt as guests returned to their plates and drinks. Slowly, conversations picked up again, and the hum of the barbecue resumed. Ethan noticed a few neighbors approaching him with tentative smiles, perhaps wanting to offer their support or maybe just to satisfy their curiosity. One of the first to approach was David Miller, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a friendly demeanor who lived a few houses down. He held out his hand to Ethan with a genuine smile. "Chief Carter. Right? Welcome to Maplewood Grove," David said, giving him a firm handshake. "Quite an entrance you made there." Ethan chuckled, a little embarrassed. "Not quite how I pictured our introduction. But thank you. And please, call me Ethan." "Ethan it is," David replied warmly. "Look, I just wanted to say I'm sorry you had to deal with, well, some of the folks around here have their own way of seeing things. Don't let it get to you. Appreciate that, David," Ethan said sincerely. "We're here to build a life, just like anyone else." Jasmine joined them, carrying a tray of freshly grilled vegetables. "So, David, tell us about the neighborhood. We'd love to know more about the place we're calling home." David's eyes sparkled with pride. "Maplewood's got its quirks, but it's a good place. Most folks here are hardworking and friendly. Been here about 15 years myself. Raised both my kids here. And they've loved it." As they chatted, a few more neighbors joined in, sharing stories about the area and laughing over neighborhood gossip. Ethan and Jasmine listened, feeling the warmth of acceptance slowly washing over them. But amidst the easy smiles and laughter, they couldn't ignore the occasional looks of discomfort from some neighbors who hadn't quite warmed up to them. From the corner of his eye, Ethan spotted Mrs. Harris's curtain twitch, a sign that she was still watching. He could almost feel her disapproval from across the yard. A silent but steady force that reminded him there was still a divide in this community, a divide that ran deeper than he had expected. The next morning, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, mentally preparing for his first official day at the precinct. The events of the previous night lingered in his mind, a reminder of the challenges that lay ahead, both in his new role and within his new community. Jasmine joined him, pouring herself a cup and sliding into the chair beside him. "Nervous about today?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "A bit," he admitted, staring into his coffee. "The precinct's smaller than what I'm used to. But I've heard good things about the team. Just hope I can make the right impression." She reached over, squeezing his hand. "You will. You've always had a way with people, Ethan. Just be yourself." He nodded, appreciating her unwavering support. "I'll keep that in mind." As he stood to get ready, he noticed a piece of paper slid under their front door. Frowning, he walked over and picked it up, unfolding it to find a handwritten note. "Keep the peace you promised. We don't need trouble here." No signature. No hint of who might have sent it. But Ethan had a strong suspicion. He showed the note to Jasmine, who read it with a frown. "Mrs. Harris. You think?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "Could be," he replied. "Or maybe someone else who shares her mindset." Jasmine set the note on the counter, her expression firm. "Well, we're not going anywhere. And we're not about to change who we are for anyone. If people have a problem with us, that's on them." Her determination filled Ethan with renewed confidence. They had moved here for a fresh start, to raise their family in a place where they could put down roots. No anonymous note was going to change that. At the precinct, Ethan was introduced to his new team. The precinct was a modest building, a stark contrast to the sprawling, busy office he had left behind in the city. But there was a warmth to the place, a sense of community that he immediately noticed. He was greeted by Officer Linda Park, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp wit and a dedication to the community. She showed him around, introducing him to other officers and staff. Ethan could sense a mix of curiosity and respect from his new team, and he was determined to earn their trust. After the tour, he settled into his office, a small but functional space with a view of the main street. He was flipping through case files when Linda knocked on his door, holding a cup of coffee. "Chief. Just thought you'd want to know," she began, leaning against the doorframe. "We got a lot of support for you after last night's BBQ incident. Word travels fast here. And some folks are talking about how you handled it." Ethan looked up, surprised. "Already?" Linda chuckled. "It's Maplewood. News travels quicker than you think. And while most people are on your side, a few, well, let's just say they aren't thrilled about new faces in leadership." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "I appreciate the heads up, Linda. I'm here to do my job, to keep this community safe and fair. If some people have a problem with that, we'll deal with it as it comes." Linda smiled, a glint of admiration in her eyes. "I think you're going to fit in just fine, Chief." As the day wore on, Ethan threw himself into his work, reviewing cases and familiarizing himself with the community's concerns. But the anonymous note lingered in his mind, a reminder that acceptance wouldn't come easily. There were deep-seated fears and prejudices simmering beneath Maplewood's calm exterior. And he could feel it, just like he had felt Mrs. Harris's gaze the night before. That evening, as he drove home, he noticed a small group of teenagers hanging out near a convenience store on the edge of the neighborhood. He slowed down, watching as they loitered, their voices loud and their laughter echoing in the quiet streets. As he parked the car and walked toward his house, one of the teenagers noticed him, nudging his friends and pointing in Ethan's direction. They all stopped, looking at him with a mixture of defiance and curiosity. Ethan hesitated, then gave them a small nod. To his surprise, one of the boys, a tall, lanky kid with a shock of red hair, called out to him, "Hey! You're the new chief, right?" the boy asked, his tone casual but curious. Ethan stopped, nodding. "That's right. Name's Ethan." The boy grinned, a mischievous glint in his eye. "We heard about you. Pretty gutsy. Moving in around here." Ethan couldn't help but smile. "Maplewood seems like a good place. But I take it not everyone feels that way." The boy shrugged. "Depends on who you ask. People like things the way they are. You know. Some don't like new folks shaking things up." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Well, I'm here to make sure everyone feels safe and respected. That's my job. The boy smirked. Good luck with that, Chief. This neighborhood's got its secrets. With that, the group sauntered off, leaving Ethan standing in the fading light. A chill creeping over him. He knew those words weren't just the musings of a teenager. There was something under the surface here. A tension that went beyond a simple dislike of newcomers. And he was determined to find out what it was. No matter how deep he had to dig. As he walked up to his house, he glanced over at Mrs. Harris's window, half expecting to see her watching. But the curtains were drawn. Her house dark and silent. The days in Maplewood Grove settled into a quiet rhythm. With Ethan diving deeper into his work at the precinct and Jasmine focusing on making their new house feel like a true home. Yet, even with their best efforts to adjust, a lingering tension hovered around them, casting an invisible boundary between the Carters and certain neighbors. Ethan felt it at the precinct as well. His team was cordial, respectful even. But he could tell that some officers, like Officer Linda Park, were more comfortable around him than others. There were a few who still seemed wary, as though waiting to see what kind of leader he would be. One evening, after another long day of paperwork and introductions, Ethan returned home to find Jasmine sitting at the kitchen table, a troubled expression on her face. She looked up as he entered, her eyes searching his. "Everything okay?" he asked, setting his keys on the counter. Jasmine hesitated before sliding a piece of paper across the table toward him. It was another note, written in the same scrawling, jagged handwriting as the first one. "This is your last warning. We don't need you here." Ethan's face hardened as he read the words. Was this under the door again? Jasmine nodded. Worry etched across her features. "Yes. I found it this afternoon." "Ethan. I don't like this. Whoever's doing this clearly wants us gone." He took a deep breath, fighting back a surge of frustration. It's probably just someone who's stuck in their ways. Change is hard for people like that. Jasmine reached out, touching his hand. "I know. But it's unsettling. This doesn't feel like simple resistance to change. There's something hostile about it." Ethan looked down at the note, the words feeling heavier with each second. "If they think they can scare us off, they're wrong. I didn't take this job just to back down at the first sign of trouble." Jasmine nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. "We're in this together. But please, be careful. Whoever's behind this isn't just playing around." Over the next few days, Ethan kept a vigilant eye on his surroundings, both at work and at home. He also began to dig into Maplewood's history, hoping to understand what might be fueling this animosity. To his surprise, he found very little. Maplewood seemed like a model suburban town on the surface, with little in the way of crime or unrest. But Ethan had been a cop for long enough to know that some places were skilled at hiding their darker sides. As he delved deeper, he began to notice a pattern. The same names appeared repeatedly in the community files, certain families who had lived in Maplewood for generations, whose influence stretched over neighborhood committees, school boards, and even local businesses. Mrs. Harris's family was among them, part of an unspoken hierarchy that seemed to govern life in Maplewood from behind the scenes. One afternoon, he was discussing some routine cases with Officer Linda Park when she glanced over her shoulder, ensuring they were alone. "Chief, I don't mean to overstep, but I wanted to ask, how are you and your family settling in?" Linda asked, her tone cautious but genuinely concerned. Ethan set down the report he'd been reviewing. It's been an adjustment. But we're making it work. Why do you ask? Linda hesitated. Then leaned in closer. Look. I know you're getting some pushback from certain folks. I just want you to know. Not everyone feels that way. Most people here are decent, it's just a handful who still think they can control things like they did decades ago. Ethan nodded slowly. His mind racing. Would one of those people be Mrs. Harris? Linda gave a small, humorless laugh. She's one of the loudest. That's for sure. But there are others, people you wouldn't necessarily see out in the open. But they hold sway here. The old guard. We call them. They're not keen on change. And they're certainly not thrilled about outsiders. He absorbed her words, feeling a strange sense of relief to have his suspicions validated. Thanks, Linda. I appreciate the heads up. And don't worry. I'm not going anywhere. Linda gave him a supportive nod before heading out. Ethan leaned back in his chair, mulling over her words. The more he learned about Maplewood, the more it felt like he was peeling back layers of a carefully constructed facade. That evening, Ethan decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. Hoping to clear his head, he moved through the familiar streets, passing by houses he recognized but still felt distant from. As he rounded the corner, he found himself near Mrs. Harris's house. Her porch light was on, and she was sitting in a rocking chair, gazing out at the street with a steely expression. Ethan considered walking by without a word. But something inside him told him it was time for a confrontation. He approached the edge of her yard, stopping just short of the fence. Evening. Mrs. Harris, he greeted. His tone polite but firm. She looked at him with a cold expression, the faintest hint of a smirk on her lips. Chief Carter. Taking in the neighborhood. Are you? I like to know the places I serve, he replied evenly. It's important to me that Maplewood remains a safe, welcoming place for everyone. Her gaze hardened. Maplewood doesn't need anyone new trying to fix what isn't broken. Ethan felt a surge of anger but kept his voice calm. Mrs. Harris. I don't know what you think of me or my family. But we're here to stay. I plan to do my job. Which means making sure this community is safe for everyone who calls it home. She gave a dry laugh. People like you don't understand places like this. You come in, thinking you can change things to suit your ways. But Maplewood has been here long before you. And it'll be here long after. I'm not here to change anything that doesn't need changing, he said. His gaze steady. But I won't stand by if anyone tries to intimidate or threaten my family. That kind of behavior isn't welcome in Maplewood, or anywhere. Mrs. Harris's smirk faded, her expression darkening. Watch yourself, Chief. Sometimes, knowing when to leave well enough alone is the difference between peace and trouble. Ethan held her gaze, refusing to back down. I'll keep that in mind. Mrs. Harris. Have a good night. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy against the pavement. The exchange left him feeling unsettled, but also more determined than ever. Mrs. Harris and the so-called old guard might think they held all the power in Maplewood. But he wasn't about to let a group of self-appointed gatekeepers push him out. The next day, the tension only seemed to intensify. At the precinct, Ethan noticed a few more sideways glances from certain officers who had been standoffish since his arrival. Rumors were starting to circulate, whispers about the Carters, about Ethan's background, about his intentions in Maplewood. By lunchtime, he'd had enough. He called a team meeting. gathering his officers in the small conference room. As they took their seats, some looked at him with curiosity. Others with guarded expressions. "Thank you all for taking the time," he began. His voice steady but commanding. "I want to address something directly. I know some of you may have heard rumors or assumptions about why I'm here. About my family. And about my plans as your chief. So let me set the record straight." The room was silent as everyone listened intently. "I came to Maplewood because I believe in what this community can be. My job is to serve and protect every resident here, regardless of their background or how long they've lived here. I'm committed to upholding that promise." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If any of you have concerns or questions, I'm here to listen. But I won't tolerate gossip. And I won't tolerate actions that undermine this precinct's mission. We're a team. And I expect every one of you to work with the same dedication and respect that this community deserves." A few officers exchanged looks. But no one spoke up. Ethan met their gazes. One by one. Making it clear that he wasn't backing down. Finally, Officer Linda gave a nod of approval. And others gradually followed, murmuring their support. As the meeting adjourned, Ethan felt a renewed sense of determination. He knew that not everyone would welcome him with open arms. But he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Maplewood had its secrets. Its unspoken rules. But he wasn't afraid to challenge them. That evening, as he returned home, Jasmine met him at the door. Her face lit up with a hopeful smile. "Guess what?" she said, holding up a flyer. "The neighborhood committee is organizing a community event next month, a harvest festival. They're inviting everyone to participate." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Think it's an olive branch?" "Maybe. Or maybe they're testing us," Jasmine replied, her smile softening. "Either way, it's an opportunity for us to show who we really are." He took her hand, feeling a flicker of hope. "Then we'll be there. No more hiding in the background." Together, they looked out at the quiet street. Knowing the festival would be their next chance to face the community, and hopefully begin breaking down the walls that had been built up long before they arrived. The day of the Maplewood Grove Harvest Festival dawned bright and crisp. The town square was alive with autumn decorations, strings of orange and gold lights, pumpkins of every size, and the aroma of warm cider filling the air. Ethan and Jasmine arrived early, eager to take part and meet more of their neighbors on friendly ground. They set up a small booth with snacks and hot cocoa, hoping to encourage people to stop by. As the morning turned to afternoon, residents trickled in, sampling treats, greeting each other warmly, and exchanging news. Ethan noticed a few familiar faces from his precinct, as well as some neighbors who had been at the barbecue. Most people seemed open and friendly, though there were a few who avoided eye contact. Mrs. Harris, however, was impossible to miss. She strolled through the festival with her chin held high, casting a wary eye over the Carter's booth. Several of her close friends hovered nearby, their expressions guarded. Ethan took a deep breath, deciding it was time to extend an olive branch of his own. He approached Mrs. Harris, who stopped and looked at him with a frown, as if anticipating a confrontation. "Mrs. Harris," he greeted her with a polite nod. "Thank you for coming to the festival. I know it means a lot to the community." Her gaze remained cold. "Festivals like these are for the people who know how to respect Maplewood," she said quietly, her voice sharp. Ethan didn't flinch. "Respect goes both ways, Mrs. Harris. I think there's room for everyone here to feel at home." She gave him a long, piercing look. then turned away without a word, leaving Ethan standing there. He felt a pang of frustration but forced himself to remain calm. It was clear Mrs. Harris wasn't going to change overnight, or perhaps at all. But he couldn't let her bitterness define his family's future here. Jasmine joined him, sensing his frustration. "Some people are just too set in their ways," she murmured, offering him a reassuring smile. He nodded, finding comfort in her presence. "We'll just keep doing our best, no matter what." As evening approached and the festival continued, Ethan and Jasmine noticed a growing crowd around their booth. Neighbors they'd hardly spoken to before were now stopping by, chatting with them, sampling the cocoa, and even thanking them for coming. To Ethan's surprise, some residents openly expressed their support for him as the new chief, admiring his stance on fairness and equality. One elderly couple, the Martins, approached Ethan with a friendly smile. "Chief Carter, we just wanted to say it's refreshing to see someone willing to stand up for everyone here," Mr. Martin said warmly. "We've lived here our whole lives, and we've seen too many people driven away by folks like Mrs. Harris," his wife added, her eyes kind. "Don't let them get to you. Change can be good." Ethan felt a swell of gratitude. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Their words bolstered him, filling him with a renewed sense of purpose. For every cold look or harsh word, there were neighbors like the Martins, people who believed in a more inclusive Maplewood. It was a reminder that real change often began in small, quiet ways, with people willing to stand up against outdated views. As the festival wound down, the Carters were packing up their booth when they heard a commotion near the entrance. They turned to see Mrs. Harris arguing with a young family who had just arrived, her face red with anger. The couple looked bewildered and embarrassed, clutching their young son's hand. Ethan approached, sensing that this was more than a simple disagreement. As he got closer, he could hear Mrs. Harris's voice, harsh and unfiltered. "We don't need any more people like you here, bringing in your noise and ruining everything," she spat, her words dripping with venom. The young couple's faces fell, their discomfort plain. The husband tried to explain, his tone calm yet strained. "We're just here to enjoy the festival, ma'am. We're part of this community, too." Before Mrs. Harris could continue, Ethan stepped between them, his voice firm. "That's enough, Mrs. Harris. Everyone is welcome here. And that includes them." Mrs. Harris's face contorted with fury. "You think you can come in here and change everything? This town was peaceful before you showed up." Ethan held her gaze, unyielding. "Maplewood is a wonderful place, but no one has the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't. We all have a right to be here. And that includes you and me." The crowd had gathered, their eyes on Ethan and Mrs. Harris. A mix of emotions on their faces: shock, discomfort, and, in some, a quiet support for Ethan's words. Mrs. Harris, realizing that she had lost her audience, turned and stormed off, her face flushed. The young family looked at Ethan with gratitude, their son clutching his father's hand a little tighter. "Thank you, Chief," the husband said, relief in his voice. Ethan gave them a reassuring smile. "You're welcome. Enjoy the festival." As the family moved on, Ethan looked around, meeting the eyes of his neighbors, who now seemed to see him in a new light. One by one, people began to approach him, offering words of gratitude and encouragement. The festival took on a new tone, one of unity and acceptance. as neighbors came together in a show of support for a more inclusive Maplewood. In the weeks following the festival, a noticeable shift took place in Maplewood Grove. Neighbors who had once been cautious or reserved began opening up, forming connections across lines that had previously divided them. The Carters found themselves invited to dinners, gatherings, and community events, welcomed as true members of the neighborhood. Mrs. Harris, however, remained isolated, her influence over the community fading as more and more people embraced the idea of a more inclusive Maplewood. Her friends, once staunchly loyal, gradually distanced themselves, unwilling to share in her bitterness. Ethan continued his work at the precinct, earning the respect of his team and the trust of the town. He knew there would always be challenges, but he also knew that Maplewood was changing for the better. One crisp autumn morning, as Ethan walked down the familiar streets, he felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The town was far from perfect, but he had made his mark, proving that one person's courage could inspire an entire community to change. As he passed by the Martins' house, Mrs. Martin waved at him from her porch, her smile warm. "Thank you for all you've done, Chief Carter," she called out. "Maplewood is lucky to have you." Ethan tipped his hat, feeling a sense of belonging he hadn't expected when he first moved here. Maplewood was now his home, a place where he and his family could grow, surrounded by people who, despite their differences, had come together to create something better. And for the first time, as he walked down the quiet, tree-lined street, Ethan knew that he and his family truly belonged. The walls of division had come down, replaced by bridges of understanding and acceptance, a lasting legacy in Maplewood Grove. Thank you for listening to the story. Please like and follow the channel to update the next stories.